Well, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for the warmth of your welcome. I didn't realize I was going to be reminded about my youth careering around Austria and Eastern Europe. It is a thrill to see so many of you. I see I'm not like the bishop who turned up at a little church in England and noticed there were only 2 elderly people sitting in the congregation. So as he mounted the pulpit, he said to the local minister, he said, "Did you tell them I was coming?" And the minister said, "No, but word seems to have got around." I've been asked to speak to you tonight about God and Stephen Hawking. Stephen Hawking was just ahead of me in Cambridge and is light years ahead of me in his intellectual power. He is arguably the world's most famous living scientist. He's recently retired from the Lucasian Professorship at Cambridge, a chair that was once held by Sir Isaac Newton, a chair that Stephen Hawking has occupied with great distinction. He has been honoured as a Companion of Honour by our Queen, and his academic career has been marked by immense distinction. He has also been an outstanding symbol of fortitude, having suffered the ravages of motor neuron disease for over 40 years. And during many of those, he's been confined to a wheelchair with his only means of verbal communication, a specially designed electronic voice synthesizer. And its instantly recognizable voice is known all over the world. He's had many distinguished students, and with them he's explored the frontiers of mathematical physics, most famously perhaps the counterintuitive mysteries of black holes. His work has led to the prediction of Hawking radiation, which, if verified to exist experimentally, would surely qualify him for the award of a Nobel Prize. And in his runaway bestseller, A Brief History of Time, Stephen Hawking brought the recondite world of fundamental physics to the coffee table, although many people have confessed to finding the contents rather beyond them. His book has been described as the most unread book in history. Now, this book was followed by several others in the same vein, which attempted quite successfully to excite a wider readership with the buzz of great science. And since his books deal with the origin of the universe, it was inevitable that he should consider the question of the existence of a divine creator. And A Brief History of Time left this matter tantalizingly open by ending with the much-quoted statement that if physicists were to find a theory of everything, that is, a theory that unified the 4 fundamental forces of nature, we would know the mind of God. In his latest book, The Grand Design, co-authored with Leonard Mlodinow, Hawking's reticence about God has disappeared, and he now challenges belief in the divine creation of the universe. It is, according to him, the laws of physics and not the will of God that provide the real explanation as to how the universe came into being. The Big Bang, he argues, was the inevitable consequence of these laws. Because there is a law of gravity, he says, the universe can and will create itself from nothing. Now, of course, the title, The Grand Design, will suggest for many people the existence of a grand designer. But that is actually what the book is intelligently designed to deny. Hawking's grand conclusion is, I quote, "Spontaneous creation is the reason there is something rather than nothing, why the universe exists, why we exist. It is not necessary to invoke God to light the blue touch paper and set the universe going." I wish to make it very clear at the beginning that I wish to engage not with Hawking's science, but with what he deduces from it regarding the existence or non-existence of God. That book begins with a list of the big questions that people have always asked. And in my recent tour of the Ivy League universities of California, they're still asking them in California at least. How can we understand the world in which we find ourselves? How does the universe behave? What is the nature of reality? Where did all this come from? Did the universe need a creator? And he lists these questions, and emanating from such a famous person, that excites the imagination. We're about to hear a world-class scientist give insight into some of the profoundest questions of metaphysics. Well, if that's what we expect, we're in for an immediate shock. For in his very next words, Hawking dismisses philosophy. Referring to his list of big questions, he writes, "Traditionally, these are questions for philosophy, but philosophy is dead. It has not kept up with modern developments in science, particularly in physics. As a result, scientists have become the torchbearers of the torch of discovery in our quest for knowledge." That is, to my mind, a stunning statement for a non-philosopher to make. Philosophy, of course, is a well-represented and distinguished subject at Hawking's own University of Cambridge. But the statement constitutes, to my mind, ladies and gentlemen, rather disturbing evidence that at least one scientist, Hawking himself, not only has not kept up with philosophy, he does not appear to understand a great deal about it. First of all, his statement about philosophy is itself a philosophical statement. It is manifestly not a statement of science. It is a metaphysical statement about science. Therefore, because his statement claims that philosophy is dead, it blatantly contradicts itself. A classic example of logical incoherence. And furthermore, his view that scientists have become the bearers of the torch of discovery is only a hairbreadth away from scientism, the view that science is the only way to truth. And that conviction, characteristic of the movement in secular thought known as the New Atheism, although its ideas, incidentally, are mostly only new in the aggressive way they're presented, rather than in their intellectual content. Now, for any scientist, let alone a science superstar, to disparage philosophy on the one hand, and then to at once to adopt a self-contradictory philosophical statement on the other, is not the wisest thing to do, especially at the beginning of a book that's designed to be convincing. And I want to contrast that attitude with the attitude of Nobel laureate Sir Peter Medawar, who pointed out the danger of scientific hubris long ago in his book, Advice to a Young Scientist. He wrote, "There's no quicker way for a scientist to bring discredit upon himself and upon his profession than roundly to declare, particularly where no such declaration is called for, that science knows or soon will know the answers to all questions worth asking, and that questions which do not admit a scientific answer are in some way non-questions or pseudo-questions that only simpletons ask and only the gullible profess to be able to answer. The existence of a limit to science is made clear," says Medawar, "by its inability to answer childlike elementary questions having to do with first and last things, questions such as, how did everything begin? What are we all here for? What is the point of living?" And Medawar adds that we must turn to imaginative literature and religion for the answers to such questions. Francis Collins is equally clear on the limitations of science. Science is powerless, he writes, to answer questions such as, why did the universe come into being? What is the meaning of human existence? What happens after we die? And clearly Medawar and Collins are passionate scientists, so there is obviously no inconsistency involved in being a committed scientist at the highest level, while simultaneously recognizing that science cannot answer every kind of question, including some of the deepest questions that human beings can ask. I'm passionate about science, ladies and gentlemen, but I agree wholeheartedly with Medawar that when we claim that science answers all questions, we are going beyond our mandate. Now, the consequence of sailing through red traffic lights is you make a habit of it. And having sailed through this red traffic light, Hawking sails through another one. Because his inadequate view of philosophy begins to show itself in an inadequate view of God. He writes, ignorance of nature's ways led people in ancient times to invent gods, to lord it over every aspect of human life. He then says that this began to change with the ancient Greek thinkers like Thales of Miletus about 2,600 years ago. The idea arose, he continues, that nature follows consistent principles that could be deciphered. And so began the long process of replacing the notion of the reign of the gods with the concept of the notion of a universe that is governed by laws of nature and created, I quote, according to a blueprint we could someday learn to read. Well, I wonder if Hawking really is expecting us to fall for the common trick of rubbishing religion by rubbishing primitive concept of gods or the God. Yet whether deliberately or not, I don't know, he confuses God with the gods, and that immediately leads him to a completely inadequate view of God as a God of the gaps who can be replaced by scientific advance. The idea here is very simple, that the ancients used to believe that lightning and thunder were caused by the gods being displeased. You do a bit of science and you discover it has to do with electrical discharges, motion of air at high speed through the atmosphere and all the rest of it. So the gods get squeezed out of lightning and thunder. And so as they get squeezed out, gradually there's no more room for God of the gods, and you're left solely with scientific explanations. That is the God of the gaps. And it seems to be very important, if we're going to understand what's going on in the contemporary God debate, we've got not only to investigate how these people understand science, but how they understand God. Because what is very evident is that the concept of God as God of the gaps is not the concept that lies at the heart of any monotheistic religion that I know. God is not the God of the gaps, he's the God of the whole show. If he's the God of everything, he is the creator and the sustainer of the universe. He's not even the God of the deists who lit the blue touch paper to set the universe going and then retired, although that's an advance on atheism, of course, a massive advance on atheism. He's the God who created and sustains. Indeed, if he had not done so, there would be nothing for physicists like Stephen Hawking to study. But it is important to grasp that God, certainly from a Christian perspective, is the creator both of the bits of the universe we don't understand and the bits we do understand. And of course, it's the bits we do understand that give the most evidence of God's existence and activity. That must be surely obvious to us. If I go to the Boeing factory, which I believe is located not far from here, I just see these huge, big cigar-shaped lumps of metal. and they look immensely complicated. But if you've studied engineering at the University of Washington, you say, just look at that jet engine. That is a perfection of design engineering. You can admire the genius of the designer, not because you don't understand, but because you do. And that is immensely important. The more I understand, and I understand very little of science, the more I admire the genius of the creator who did it that way. I'll come back to that in a moment. But let me come to the heart of the grand design. Because there is a law of gravity, the universe can and will create itself out of nothing. Well, the first question I want to ask, and I had to read that many times before I began to understand it, what does Hawking mean when he uses the word nothing in the statement? The universe can and will create itself out of nothing. Because if you notice the assumption in the first part of the assertion, because there is a law of gravity, so there is something. The universe will create itself out of nothing. Well, that's a bit curious for a start, isn't it? And one presumes, therefore, that he is assuming that a law of gravity exists. But I would presume that he also believes that gravity exists. Because what would a law of gravity mean if gravity itself didn't exist? So the main point I want to make is that a law of gravity and gravity is not nothing. If he is using that word in its usual philosophically correct sense of non-being. And if he isn't, he should have told us so. So on the face of it, this key assertion of his book appears to be simultaneously asserting that the universe is both created from nothing and from something, which is not a very promising start. Of course, one might add, for good measure, the fact that when physicists talk about nothing, they often appear to mean a quantum vacuum, which is manifestly not nothing. And in fact, Hawking is probably alluding to that when he later writes, we are a product of quantum fluctuations in the very early universe. I'm very tempted to say, ladies and gentlemen, possibly this is a little bit too much ado about nothing. Now, the situation does not improve when we go on to examine this statement more carefully. Let's look at the logic of the second part of it. The universe can and will create itself from nothing. If I say X creates Y, then in English or any other language I know, that simply means I presuppose the existence of X to explain the existence of Y. So if I say X creates X, I'm saying I presuppose the existence of X to explain the existence of X. Now that is self-contradictory, even if you put X equal to the universe. To presuppose the existence of the universe in order to account for the existence of the universe sounds like something out of Alice in Wonderland, not science. Now, it's very seldom I find in one statement two distinct levels of contradiction. But Hawking seems to have outdone all my experience by inventing a statement with three distinct levels of contradiction. He says the universe comes from nothing that turns out to be something. He says the universe creates itself. But that is not all, ladies and gentlemen. His notion that a law of nature, gravity, explains the existence of the universe is also self-contradictory, since a law of nature depends for its existence on nature existing. Self-contradiction number 3. So here's the challenge of the evening. Go home and write another sentence that's got 3 levels of self-contradiction built into it. Now, my philosopher friends are very tempted to say, this is what comes of saying philosophy is dead. One of my colleagues at Oxford is Peter Atkins, and I've had a public debate with him. He's a very well-known atheist, and he believes that space-time generates its own dust in the process of its own self-assembly. And Atkins dubs this the cosmic bootstrap principle. It's the same thing that Hawking's talking about. But his Oxford colleague, philosopher of religion, Keith Ward, is surely right to say that Atkins' view of the universe is as blatantly self-contradictory as the name he gives to it. It is logically impossible for a cause to bring about some effect without already being in existence. Ward concludes, between the hypothesis of God and the hypothesis of a cosmic bootstrap, there's no competition. We were always right to think that persons or universes who seek to pull themselves up by their own bootstraps are forever doomed to failure. My conclusion, ladies and gentlemen, is what this central statement of Hawking's book shows is that nonsense remains nonsense even when it's talked by world-famous scientists. But that's the problem. What obscures the illogicality of such statements is the fact that they're made by famous scientists. And the general public is not aware that a statement by a scientist is not necessarily a statement of science. And science has such cultural authority in our world that that confusion tends to persist. Immense prestige and authority, ladies and gentlemen, do not compensate for faulty logic. Now, the worrying thing to me about this is not some peripheral thesis in the book. It's the central argument. And if the key argument is invalid, in one sense, there's very little to say. On the other hand, since the laws of nature, gravity in particular, play a major role in Hawking's argument, it might be important nonetheless for me to comment on what also appears to be serious misunderstandings on the nature and capacity of law itself. Before I go into that, I would like to set it in the context. Hawking's erroneous concept of God as a God of the gaps has the serious consequences for him in his book that it does for Richard Dawkins in his book. And that is that they end up by presenting the public with a stark choice. You've got to choose between God and science. In Hawking's case, between God and the laws of physics. Talking about M theory, and that is Hawking's chosen candidate for a theory of everything, he writes, M theory predicts that a great many universes were created out of nothing. Their creation does not require the intervention of some supernatural being or God. Rather, these multiple universes arise naturally from physical law. So what is Hawking doing? He's denying the existence of God and assigning the creative aspect to physical law. And it seems to me that he's making a classical category mistake by confusing two fundamentally distinct concepts, physical law on the one hand and personal agency. That is, he is setting false alternatives before us. God is an explanation of the universe, but not the same type of explanation that arises from physical law. Let me, since we're near Boeing factory, make this clearer by replacing the universe by a jet engine. And you imagine I have a jet turbofan sitting here, and I say, ladies and gentlemen, I want to offer you two explanations of this jet engine. Firstly, the laws of physics and advanced mechanical engineering. That's the first explanation. The second explanation is Sir Frank Whittle. Choose. You know that Sir Frank Whittle, of course, invented the jet engine, I hope. Perhaps I should have used Henry Ford instead. You'd have heard of him. So let's use Henry Ford. Here's a Galaxy motor car, and I say, right, two explanations, one in terms of mechanical engineering and the laws of physics, and the other Henry Ford. Choose. Well, you'd say, don't be silly. Because we need both explanations to give a full explanation of the jet engine of the motor car. That is, you need an explanation in terms of law and mechanism, and you need an explanation in terms of personal agency and intelligence. Those explanations of the jet engine and the motor car engine do not compete with each other. They're not even in the same category. They complement one another, and yet this is exactly what I find happening with Richard Dawkins and Stephen Hawking. Choose. But the reason they're forced to this position is because they think of God as a God of the gaps. And if God is a God of the gaps, where God gets smaller, science gets larger, of course you have to choose. That's logical. But you see, it's their faulty concept of God is leading them to make a false set of alternatives as the only possibility. When Isaac Newton discovered his law of gravitation, he didn't say, oh, now I've got a law of gravity, I don't need God. No, what he did was to write Principia Mathematica, the most famous book in the history of science, expressing the hope that it would persuade the thinking man to believe in God. The laws of physics can help us understand how a jet engine works, but not how it came to exist in the first place. A jet engine could not have been created by the laws of physics on their own. That needed the work of Whittle. Come to think of it, ladies and gentlemen. The laws of physics plus Frank Whittle could not produce a jet engine on their own. There also needed to be some humble matter in existence to work on. Matter may be humble stuff, but it's not produced by laws. So it is a very interesting situation that we have reached. I hope you've noticed, ladies and gentlemen, that scientists didn't put the universe there. Neither did their theories nor the laws of mathematical physics. And yet Hawking seems to think they did. And he says this in A Brief History of Time, actually. The usual approach to science of constructing a mathematical model cannot answer the questions of why there should be a universe for the model to describe. Why does the universe go to all the bother of existing? Is the unified theory so compelling that it brings about its own existence, or does it need a creator? And if so, does he have any other effect on the universe? But now Hawking has moved on. He claims that all that is necessary to create the universe is the law of gravity. And when asked on Larry King Live, which I believe is a program in your country, where gravity came from, he answered, M theory. Well, to say that a theory or physical laws could bring the universe or anything at all for that matter into existence is to misunderstand the nature of theory. And we need to investigate that very carefully. Physical laws cannot create anything on their own. They are simply, usually, a mathematical description of what normally happens under certain given conditions to a pre-existing system. Now, let's take Hawking's own example of law. He's now explaining to the general public what he means by a physical law. The sun rises in the east and it sets in the west. Okay, we can accept that as a regularity characteristic of our universe physical law, but surely it's obvious that that law didn't create the sun, nor does it make the sun move. It is descriptive and predictive, but not creative. Similarly, Newton's law of gravitation doesn't create gravity or the matter on which gravity acts. In fact, Newton himself was careful to explain that it doesn't even explain gravity. Now, this is quite serious, actually, because the laws of physics are not only incapable of creating anything, they cannot cause anything to happen. Newton's celebrated laws of motion never caused a billiard ball to cross the green baize table. That can only be done by people using a pool cue. The laws can help us analyze, for at least the first few bounces before chaotic effects set in, the trajectory of the ball. But the laws are powerless to move it. Another example of this basic misunderstanding is given by well-known physicist Paul Davies, with whom I've also had a lengthy debate, which you can hear on the web. There is no need to invoke anything supernatural in the origins of the universe or of life. I've never liked the idea of divine tinkering. Notice that. I've never liked it. But that isn't science, ladies and gentlemen. That's preference. Well, at least it's honest. And I admire Paul for being honest at this point. For me, it's much more inspiring to believe that a set of mathematical laws can be so clever as to bring all these things into being. I once asked Peter Atkins, when I met him in Oxford, I said, Peter, tell me, what created the universe? And he said, mathematics. And I started to laugh. And he said, why are you laughing? Well, I said, I am a mathematician. I wish you were right. I said, let's take something pretty basic. 1 + 1 = 2. $1 plus $1 equals $2. Did 1 + 1 = 2 ever put $2 in your pocket? If I put $1,000 into the bank and later another 1,000, the laws of arithmetic will rationally explain how it is I now have 2,000. But if I never put any money into the bank myself and simply leave it to the laws of arithmetic, I shall be permanently bankrupt. Perhaps that's the problem behind our financial crisis, ladies and gentlemen. C.S. Lewis, of course, got this years ago and saw it with spectacular clarity. Of the laws of nature, he writes, they produce no events. They state the pattern to which every event, if only it can be induced to happen, must conform, just as the rules of arithmetic state the pattern to which all transactions with money must conform, if only you can get a hold of any. Thus, in one sense, the laws of nature cover the whole field of space and time. In another, what they leave out is precisely the whole real universe, the incessant torrent of actual events which makes up true history. That must come from somewhere else. To think the laws can produce it is like thinking you can create real money by simply doing sums. Laws give us only a universe of ifs and ands. Bookkeeping, continued to all eternity, could never produce one farthing. The world of strict naturalism, in which clever mathematical laws all by themselves bring the universe and life into existence, is pure science fiction. Theories and laws do not bring matter energy into existence. And the view that they nevertheless somehow have done seems a rather desperate refuge from the alternative explanation hinted at by Hawking's question, or does it need a creator? So, ladies and gentlemen, I conclude at this stage that Hawking has signally failed to answer the central question of his book, why is there something rather than nothing? He says that the existence of gravity means the creation of the universe was inevitable, but how did gravity come to exist in the first place? What was the creative force behind its birth? Who put it there? And so on. Anand Sandage, widely regarded as the father of modern astronomy, the discoverer of the quasar and winner of the Crawford Prize, which is astronomy's equivalent of the Nobel Prize, is in no doubt about his answer. I find it improbable that such order came out of chaos. There has to be some organizing principle. God to me is a mystery, but is the explanation for the miracle of existence, why there is something rather than nothing. So let me finally say something about the grand design. The word design figures in the title because, like every other physicist, Hawking is confronted with powerful evidence of it, as he himself explains in the book. Our universe and its laws appear to have a design that is both tailor-made to support us and, if we are to exist, leaves little room for alteration. That is not easily explained. And it raises the natural question of why it is that way. The discovery relatively recently of the extreme fine-tuning of so many of the laws of nature could at least lead some of us back to the old idea that the grand design is the work of some grand designer. That is not the answer of modern science. Our universe seems to be one of many, each with different laws. Well, one thing is clear, Hawking recognizes a grand design, and he devotes almost an entire chapter to giving extensive detail of the spectacular fine-tuning, both of the laws of nature and their associated physical constants. The evidence he gives is impressive and certainly fits in with what he calls the old idea that this grand design is the work of some grand designer. Well, of course it does. It fits like a glove, because there actually is a grand designer. But notice, the old idea. Well, it certainly is an old idea. It's a very ancient idea. The question to ask is not how old is it, but is it true? Simply to say that it is old can erroneously give the impression that what is old is necessarily false and has been superseded. And secondly, it can give the further erroneous impression that no one holds it today, but some of the finest minds in science hold it today. The conviction that there is a grand designer, God the Creator, is held by millions, if not billions of people, incidentally, vastly more than those who hold the atheist alternative. And may I remind you, ladies and gentlemen, that this is not some idiosyncratic notion. It was the basic notion that drove the rise of modern science. C.S. Lewis formulated what's sometimes been called Merton's thesis or Whitehead's thesis beautifully when he said, men became scientific because they expected law in nature, and they expected law in nature because they believed in a lawgiver. I'm not ashamed of being a Christian and a scientist, because Christianity gave me my subject. Newton, Kepler, Galileo, Babbage, Clerk Maxwell, and a whole array of luminaries of science. Their belief in God didn't hinder them doing science. It was the motor that drove it. History of science is a very important topic, ladies and gentlemen. And we so easily forget that the phenomenon which we now call modern science, arguably the major contributor to it, was belief in a God who created, ordered, and sustained this universe. But Hawking says this is not the answer of modern science. Notice the statement, modern science. He would have been better to say this is not the answer of many modern scientists, because there are many modern scientists like myself who do believe not only in a grand design but a grand designer. But he goes too far in saying that the answer of modern science is the multiverse. That is, the notion that, roughly speaking, there are many scenarios of this, but the basic idea is that there are many universes, some suggest infinitely many, that anything that can happen will happen in some universe. So it's not surprising, goes the argument, that there's at least one like ours. Here's a set of false alternatives again. Let's suppose there is a multiverse. How does that exclude God? Can God not create more than one universe? In fact, a book that I'm moderately familiar with suggests he might have done. It's called the Bible. The idea that God and a multiverse are, by definition, mutually exclusive is very bad philosophy, and that has been pointed out by many people. So the multiverse concept of itself cannot rule God out. Now, with the multiverse, Hawking is moving out beyond science, and many of his colleagues admit it. Paul Davies says all cosmological models are constructed by augmenting the results of observations by some sort of philosophical principle. But in saying that the multiverse is the voice of modern science, this is a false impression, because there are very weighty voices in this field of M theory that do not support his view. The most prominent mathematician among my colleagues in the Maths Institute at Oxford is Sir Roger Penrose. He is as distinguished as Hawking and shared with him the Wolf Prize in mathematics. Listen to what Roger Penrose, who worked for years with Hawking, says about his use of the multiverse in this book. It's overused, and this is a place where it's overused. It's an excuse for not having a good theory. That's pretty strong stuff, isn't it? And in fact, my teacher of quantum mechanics at Cambridge, Professor Sir John Polkinghorne, says that it's much more economical to believe in one universe created by God than in an infinite ensemble of other universes, none of which, other than this, is accessible by us. I'm tempted, of course, as an Irishman, to add that belief in God seems to me to be a much more rational option if the alternative is to believe that every other universe that can possibly exist does exist, including one in which Richard Dawkins is the Archbishop of Canterbury, Christopher Hitchens the Pope, and Billy Graham has just been voted Atheist of the Year. Now, to be serious, but perhaps I was being serious, Hawking's ultimate theory is called M-theory, this theory of supersymmetric gravity that involves very sophisticated concepts such as vibrating strings in 11 dimensions. I don't understand it, ladies and gentlemen. And as I said at the beginning, I'm not qualified to comment on it. But Hawking's argument is, if it's correct, there is no room for God. Now, just after he published the book, a letter appeared in the London Times by one of Hawking's distinguished students, who's now a well-known professor of theoretical physics in his own right in the University of Alberta, Don Page, and he's co-authored 8 papers with Hawking. And he wrote, "I certainly would agree," he wrote to me, that is, and I've got his permission to quote it to you, "I certainly would agree that even if M-theory were a fully formulated theory, which it isn't, and were correct, which of course we don't know, that would not imply that God did not create the universe." So although it doesn't affect my argument in the slightest, it's worth noting that not all physicists are as convinced as Hawking about M-theory. Penrose again, M-theory is very far from any testability. The book, The Grand Design, is a bit misleading. It gives you this impression of a theory that's going to explain everything. It's nothing of the sort. It's not even a theory. And he added M-theory was hardly science. And you might notice that Penrose's criticisms are not based on Christianity. He is a member of the British Humanist Association. But one of the best reviews of The Grand Design, I must quote this to you, is by Tim Radford. He says, "In this very brief history of modern cosmological physics, the laws of quantum and relativistic physics represent things to be wondered at but widely accepted, just like biblical miracles. M-theory invokes something different, a prime mover, a begetter, a creative force that is everywhere and nowhere. This force cannot be identified by instruments or examined by comprehensible mathematical prediction, and yet it contains all possibilities. It incorporates omnipresence, omniscience, and omnipotence, and it's a big mystery. Remind you of anything?" A move to advance the cause of atheism by means of a highly speculative, untestable theory that is not within the zone of evidence-based science, and which, even if it were true, would not dislodge God in any case, is not exactly impressive. Now much, and I say this now in conclusion, much of the rationale behind Hawking's argument lies in the idea that there is a deep-seated conflict between science and religion. That is not a discord I recognize. I recognize a conflict, though, ladies and gentlemen. It's deeper. It is between two worldviews. The worldview of materialism, of naturalism, of atheism, and the worldview of theism. It should be obvious from the rise of science that I mentioned earlier that there's no essential conflict. Now, the fact that science is a mainly rational activity helps us to identify another serious flaw in Hawking's thinking. Like Francis Crick, he wants us to believe that we human beings are nothing but mere collections of fundamental particles of nature. Hawking reduces biology to physics and chemistry and concludes, it is hard to see how free will can operate if our behavior is determined by physical law. So it seems we are no more than biological machines and that free will is just an illusion. So he's becoming a determinist. And John Tulkinghorn writes about this kind of a development. In the opinion of many thinkers, he says, human freedom is closely associated with human rationality. If we were deterministic beings, what would validate the claim that our utterance constituted rational discourse? Would not the sounds issuing from mouths or the marks we made on paper be simply the actions of automata? All proponents of deterministic theories, whether social and economic, Marx, or sexual, Freud, or genetic, Dawkins and E.O. Wilson, need a covert disclaimer on their own behalf, accepting their own contribution from reductive dismissal. And my chief criticism, ladies and gentlemen, of all of this is that Hawking's atheism undermines the very rationality we need to do science itself. In a recent interview with the Guardian newspaper in the UK, Hawking said, "Heaven is a fairy story for those afraid of the dark." I was asked to comment. I said, "Atheism is a fairy story for those afraid of the light." As a scientist, I find that the most compelling explanation for what I see is that behind the universe there is a God of infinite wisdom and intelligence. It is my science and not only my Christianity that tells me that the best explanation goes like this. In the beginning was the Word. And the Word was with God, and the Word was God. All things came to be through him, and without him, nothing came to be that came to be. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.